Welcome to our channel, Auburn Chronicles. If you enjoyed rural stories, like and subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. And now, Adam will take us into today's story.
On a quiet Saturday morning in April of 1971, Martin Cole walked into the feed store in Lancaster County, Nebraska, and did something so ordinary it should have passed without notice. He set two small paper sacks on the counter. One was corn seed, the other was soybean seed. The clerk behind the register looked down at them, then back up at Martin. "You planting two fields this year?" he asked. Martin shook his head. "Same field." The clerk paused. He thought maybe he had misheard. "You mean rotation?" Martin said no again. "Corn and beans. Same ground. Same season." The clerk stared at him for a long second, the way people do when they're deciding whether someone is joking. Martin wasn't joking. The clerk rang it up slowly, still trying to figure out what he had just heard. "Well," he said finally, handing Martin the receipt. "Good luck with that." It didn't take long for the story to spread. Lancaster County wasn't the kind of place where strange things stayed quiet. By lunchtime, the men at the diner had heard about it. By evening, the feed store owner had told the grain elevator operator. By the end of the week, almost everyone in the county knew that Martin Cole was planting corn and beans together in the same field. And they all had the same reaction. They laughed. Some laughed politely, the way neighbors do when they don't want to sound cruel. Others laughed openly. Farming in that part of Nebraska followed rules that had been passed down for generations. One crop per field. Corn this year. Soybeans the next. Wheat when a rotation called for it. Everyone knew that. Everyone had always known that. So when people heard that Martin was planning to mix two crops together like some kind of experiment, the conclusion came quickly. Martin Cole had lost his mind. The nickname showed up not long after. It started at the diner, probably over coffee. Someone called him Double Trouble Martin, and the name stuck. It followed him everywhere. At church, at the grain elevator, at the hardware store. Whenever someone spotted him walking in, someone else would say it loud enough for everyone to hear. "Here comes Double Trouble." Most people expected the same ending. They figured Martin would try for one season, watch the whole thing fail, and quietly go back to doing what everyone else did. That's how these things usually went. The county had seen plenty of ideas come and go over the years. Some traveling salesman would promise bigger yields, farmers would try it once, and the land would prove them wrong. People assumed this would be no different. Martin never argued when people joked about it. That confused them even more. When Roy Dennison drove past Martin's farm one afternoon and saw the first rows being planted, he pulled his truck over to the edge of the field and climbed out. Roy had been farming the land north of Martin's for almost 40 years. He leaned against the fence and watched the tractor move slowly down the row. When Martin reached the end and shut the engine down, Roy called out, "You really doing this?" Martin climbed down from the tractor. "Doing what?" Roy pointed at the rows. "Corn and beans in the same field. That what you're doing?" Martin nodded. Roy looked out across the dirt, shaking his head slowly. "I've been farming longer than you've been alive," he said, "and I've never seen anyone try something like that." Martin shrugged a little. "There's a first time for everything." Roy laughed. Not exactly. Just the kind of laugh that says a man is making a mistake he hasn't figured out yet. "You know what's going to happen, right?" he said. "Those crops are going to fight each other. Same soil, same water, same sun. One of them will choke the other out." Martin didn't argue. He just said, "Maybe." Roy waited for more, but Martin didn't add anything. "Well," Roy said finally, climbing back into his truck, "we'll see." That phrase started showing up everywhere after that. "We'll see." It became the county's way of talking about Martin without saying directly that he was wrong. At Patterson Equipment, the John Deere dealership in town, Glenn Patterson heard the story the same day Roy did. Glenn had built his business by knowing exactly how farmers worked. He sold them tractors, combines, planters, machines designed for fields that followed the rules. One crop, straight rows, predictable harvest. When someone told him Martin was mixing crops together like some old experiment, Glenn drove out to the farm himself. He brought his son Glenn Jr. along, mostly because he thought the whole thing would be funny. They stood at the edge of the field, looking over the freshly planted rows. Glenn kicked the dirt with the toe of his boot and said, "Martin, I have to ask, what exactly is the plan here?" Martin answered calmly, "Corn grows tall. Beans climb. Glenn stared at him. That's the whole plan? That's the start of it. Glenn laughed, the deep belly laugh of a man who believed he understood how the world worked. You've got good land here, he said. Good seed, too. Shame to waste it on a science project. Martin crossed his arms and looked out across the field. It's not a science project. Glenn nodded slowly, still smiling. Sure looks like one. Glenn Jr. laughed too, and the two of them climbed back into their truck. As they drove away, Glenn leaned out the window and shouted one last thing. Don't worry, Martin. If it all fails, I'll give you a fair price on seed next year. By that point, the story had spread so far that people were starting to drive past Martin's land just to look at it. They didn't see anything unusual yet, just rows of dirt waiting for seeds to grow. But everyone was curious about the outcome. Farmers understand risk better than most people. They know that one bad season can erase years of work. That's why most of them stick close to what they know works. Martin Cole had grown up in that same world. His family had been farming that land since the late 1800s. The farm had passed from his great-grandfather to his grandfather to his father. Each generation planted the same crops in the same pattern. Corn, soybeans, wheat, rotation, season after season. When Martin was a boy, he learned the same lessons every other farm kid learned. Wake before sunrise. Work until the light fades. Trust the land, but never try to outsmart it. By the time he was 16, he could run half the planting operation himself. No one in Lancaster County would have described him as reckless. If anything, Martin had always been the quiet one, the kind of man who listened more than he talked, the kind of man who didn't rush decisions, which made the whole thing even stranger to people who knew him. Because this idea, planting two crops together, looked reckless. It looked like the kind of mistake people make when they get too clever. What no one in the county knew yet was that the idea hadn't started in a field at all. It had started months earlier on a cold winter afternoon in a used bookstore in Lincoln. Martin had been looking through a stack of old agricultural books when he found one that caught his attention. It was thin, dusty, and printed decades earlier by a professor from Cornell. Most people would have passed it by. Martin bought it for a few dollars and took it home. Inside was a chapter about something called companion planting. The book described a technique used by Native American farmers long before tractors or fertilizers existed. Corn, beans, and squash grown together in the same mound. The corn rose tall and gave the beans something to climb. The beans fed nitrogen back into the soil. The squash covered the ground and kept moisture in. 3 crops working together instead of competing. Martin read that chapter more than once. The idea stayed in his head all winter. When spring finally came, the decision felt simple to him. Not obvious, but simple. The land had always been treated as if every plant were competing against the others. But what if some plants actually helped each other? What if the rules everyone followed weren't the only rules that worked? Martin didn't announce the idea to the county. He didn't call meetings or write letters or try to convince anyone. He simply walked into the feed store one Saturday morning and bought 2 kinds of seed. And by the time the rumors finished spreading across Lancaster County, Martin Cole had already planted 80 acres of corn with beans tucked between the rows. The seeds were in the ground. The jokes had started, and the whole county was waiting for the same moment. Harvest. What made the waiting harder was that Martin did not have the kind of personality people expected from a man doing something strange. If he had been loud, arrogant, the sort of fellow who liked to hear himself talk, the county would have known what to do with him. They would have written him off as one more man in love with his own ideas. But Martin Cole wasn't like that. He was steady, quiet. He paid his bills on time, showed up to church, helped neighbors pull tractors out of mud, and rarely had much to say unless he had thought it through first. That was why his father had a harder time with this than most people did. August Cole had spent his whole life trusting patterns that had already proven themselves. He had farmed through dry years, lean years, and years when the land gave more than anyone expected. He had survived by being careful. So when he sat at the kitchen table one evening and watched Martin come in with dirt on his boots and that same calm look on his face, he finally said what had been sitting in his chest since planting started. "You really believe this is going to work?" It wasn't a question. Martin poured himself some coffee and sat across from him. "Eat dough." August looked down at his hands for a moment. They were old hands, stiff now, shaped by decades of work. Your grandfather never did this, he said. Neither did I. Martin nodded. I know. There's usually a reason for that. Martin let a second pass before he answered. Maybe there is, he said. Or maybe there used to be another way, and somewhere along the line we stopped paying attention. August looked up at him then, not angry exactly, but disappointed in a way only fathers can be when a son steps outside the road they laid down for him. Books make things sound simple, he said. Fields don't. Martin took a sip of coffee. I'm not trusting the book over the field, he said. I'm trusting that the field might tell us something if we stop assuming we already know everything. August didn't like that answer. Not because it was disrespectful. It wasn't. Martin never spoke to him that way. He didn't like it because he could hear that his son had already made peace with the risk. And once a man has done that, there isn't much use trying to argue him out of it. The strange thing was that Martin himself didn't feel brave. Not the way people later made it sound. He was uneasy that spring. He checked the rows more often than usual. He watched the weather the way all farmers do, except now every change in sky or soil seemed to carry extra weight. When the first shoots broke through the ground, he walked the field at sunrise and again before supper, crouching down to inspect the spacing, the health of the sprouts, the feel of the soil in his hand. The corn came up first, thin and green. The beans followed. There was no applause, no sign from heaven. Just two crops doing exactly what seeds are supposed to do if the ground accepts them. But in Lancaster County, that was enough to keep people talking. Men who would have driven straight past another field slowed down when they reached Martin's. Some stopped. A few got out. By then the joke had gotten bigger than the planting itself. The field had become a kind of public test. Some people wanted Martin to fail because they had already said he would. Others wanted him to fail because if he didn't, it would raise a harder question than anyone liked to face. What else had they accepted just because it was familiar? Roy Dennison came by more than once that spring, though he always acted as if he had some other reason to be there. One day he stood at the fence with his thumbs hooked in his belt and watched the first rows build height. They're both coming up, he said, as if he were annoyed by that fact. So far, Martin replied. Roy squinted toward the beans. That's the easy part, he said. Getting them out of the ground. Trouble starts later, once they want the same thing. Martin knelt down and brushed a bit of dirt away from the base of one row. I don't think they want exactly the same thing. Roy gave a dry laugh. Plant or plants? Martin stood up. Not all of them. Roy shook his head. You always this stubborn. Or did that book do it to you? Martin smiled a little. The book just gave me a reason to try. Roy looked over the field again. You know what bothers people, don't you? What's that? You're acting too calm for a man who may be wasting 80 acres. Martin leaned against the fence post and looked out at the field the same way Roy was looking at it. Maybe because I don't think I'm wasting it. Roy let that sit for a moment. Then he said, well, we'll see, and walked back to his truck. Glenn Patterson was less patient. He came out again after the corn was high enough to make the rows look real, not theoretical. This time he didn't laugh right away. That was new. He paced along the edge of the field with his jaw set, studying the way the beans were beginning to thread themselves upward. You know what I can't figure out? He said. You planted a field that no machine is really designed for, and somehow you're standing here like that doesn't bother you. Martin said, it bothers me some. Glenn looked at him. Then why do it? Martin's answer came fast. Because I'd rather be nervous about something worth trying than comfortable doing what everybody else is doing. Glenn stared at him, and for a moment the answer irritated him more than the field itself. Men like Glenn built their confidence on systems that made sense. Inputs, equipment, rows, yield, repeat. A farmer who could not be talked back into that system was a problem. You get one bad result, Glenn said, and this whole county is going to remember it for 10 years. Martin nodded. Probably. That not bother you? Not enough to stop. Glenn rubbed his chin and looked out toward the road, where another truck was slowing down to take a look. People are talking, Martin. I know. They think you've gone strange. Martin shrugged. Wouldn't be the first thing people got wrong. That answer stayed with Glenn more than he wanted to admit. He left without laughing this time, and that alone told its own story. Still, talking to County did not ease up. If anything, It sharpened as the season moved on. There's a particular kind of pleasure people take in waiting for a prediction of failure to come true. It makes them feel wise before the fact. At the diner, men discussed Martin's field as if it were a slow accident. At church, women asked Eleanor in soft voices how Martin was holding up, which was their polite way of asking whether he had come to his senses yet. Eleanor handled it better than most people would have. She knew who her husband was. She had seen the way he thought things through. One evening, after another week of comments from town, she found him in the barn checking equipment and said, "Does it get to you?" Martin didn't pretend not to understand. Some days more than others. You could still decide 1 year was enough. He looked at the wrench in his hand, then set it down. That's not really what they want. What do they want? They want me to admit I should never have tried. Eleanor leaned against the doorway and watched him. And should you? Martin smiled without much humor. I don't think so. Then let them talk. Martin looked at her and gave the first honest laugh he'd had all day. That's easy for you to say. She nodded. It is. I'm not the one they nicknamed. He laughed again at that, and it loosened something in him. Not all support comes in the form of speeches. Sometimes it is just one person refusing to act embarrassed by you. As summer settled in, the field stopped looking like a mistake and started looking, to some eyes at least, like something harder to dismiss. The corn was strong. Not weak. Not stunted. Strong. Taller than some of the neighboring corn by midsummer. The beans had not disappeared under the shade the way Glenn said they would. They had found the stalks and started climbing. The rows no longer looked clean in the familiar way. They looked dense, busy, a little strange, but not wrong. That difference began to unsettle people. Roy noticed it before he admitted it. One afternoon in August, he stopped again, this time without pretending he was just passing by. He stepped out, stood at the edge, and looked over the field longer than before. The corn's tall, he said. Martin, who was fixing a gate nearby, walked over. It is. Roy pointed toward the beans wrapping themselves around the stalks. And those didn't die off. No, Roy didn't speak for several seconds. He had enough farming years behind him to know when his own certainty had started to wobble. I still don't like the look of it, he said at last. Martin almost smiled. You don't have to like the look of it. Roy grunted. Looks messy. Maybe. Messy usually means trouble. Martin looked across the rows. Sometimes it just means something's happening you're not used to seeing. Roy gave him a sideways glance, not fully annoyed, not fully impressed. Then he asked the first serious question he had asked all season. You really think the beans are helping that corn? Martin answered the way he always did when he was sure of something. Calmly. Eat dough. Roy looked back at the field again. And if you're right, Martin said, then I've got more than one harvest coming. That line got repeated in town almost as much as the nickname. Some repeated it as a joke. Others repeated it because they could hear, maybe for the first time, that Martin actually had a real belief under all this, not just a stubborn streak. But the closer harvest came, the more the county returned to its original position. Because curiosity is one thing. Numbers are another. No farmer in Lancaster County judged a season by how interesting a field looked in August. They judged it by what came off the land in October. That was where stories stopped and receipts started. That was where men had to face what the year had actually given them. Martin knew that too. He said less as summer turned. He walked the field. He checked the pods. He checked the ears. He went over the combine twice. There was no triumph in him yet. No private speech about proving everyone wrong. Only concentration. The stakes were too real for vanity. If the field came in badly, the county would laugh. That part he could take. What mattered more was that he would have tied up good seed, good labor, and good land in something that did not return enough to justify it. He knew the risk. He had always known it. That was what separated his decision from foolishness. Foolish men ignore risk. Martin had counted it. He had simply decided it was still worth taking. One evening not long before harvest, August stepped outside and found Martin standing by the porch looking out at the fields in the fading light. For a while, neither of them said anything. Then August asked, You nervous? Martin answered honestly, Yes. August nodded once. Good. Martin looked over at him. Good. A man ought to be nervous when a whole season comes down to numbers. Martin let out a slow breath. You still think I'm making a mistake? August folded his arms. I think farming has a way of punishing people who get too confident. Martin looked back out at the rows. I'm not confident. August studied his son for a moment, then said something Martin did not expect. No, he said. You're not. He paused. That may be the one thing in your favor. It wasn't approval. Not exactly. But it was the first time August had spoken as though this might be something other than madness. Martin remembered that later. The county did not know it yet, but by then the laughter had already started to change. It was quieter, less certain. Men still made jokes, but they made them with one eye on the field. They still called him Double Trouble Martin, but now there was something under the nickname besides amusement. Doubt. Not about Martin. About themselves. Because the closer harvest got, the more one possibility began to bother them. What if the strange field worked? What if the man they had all laughed at had seen something they had missed? What if the old rules were not wrong, exactly, but incomplete? By early October, Lancaster County was no longer waiting to be entertained. It was waiting to find out whether Martin Cole had made a fool of himself, or whether he had done something much more unsettling. Something that would be harder to laugh off. Something that would force every man who had mocked him to look at his own fields a little differently. And when the combines finally rolled, nobody said it out loud, but half the county was watching. Harvest came the way it always did in Lancaster County. Quiet at first, then suddenly everything happening at once. One week the fields were still green and holding their breath. The next week the air had turned sharp. The mornings came with frost, and men across the county were climbing into their combines before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. October had a way of making every farmer serious. All the talk from spring and summer stopped mattering once the machines started moving. Numbers were coming, and numbers had a way of ending arguments. Martin Cole knew that as well as anyone. He had spent the entire season listening to predictions about how his field would fail, and now the moment had come where the land would answer for him. The morning he began harvesting the corn, he walked out before daylight and stood for a few minutes looking across the rows. The field looked different than it had in April, different than it had in July. The corn was tall and dry now, the leaves rustling in the wind. Between the rows the beans had matured, their pods thick and hanging. It was a strange sight if you had grown up in Lancaster County. Too full, too busy, not the clean rows people were used to seeing. But strange did not mean weak. Martin had learned that over the summer. He climbed into the combine and started the engine. The sound carried across the field and out toward the road. The first pass always felt heavier than the rest. The machine rolled forward and the header pulled the corn down row by row. Stalks disappeared into the machine, and the first kernels began rattling into the tank. Martin kept his eyes forward, but every farmer knows the moment when he first checks the yield monitor. The number climbed slowly at first, then steadied. Martin watched it settle. He did not smile. He did not pump his fist or say anything out loud. He simply kept harvesting. But inside the cap something had shifted. Because the number was not low. It was not average either. It was strong. By mid-morning a truck had already slowed on the road to watch him work. In a place like Lancaster County, a man harvesting an unusual field attracts attention fast. By afternoon, Roy Dennison's pickup was parked along the fence line again. Roy climbed out and stood with his arms crossed, watching the combine move across the rows. Martin finished the pass and swung the machine around. When he saw Roy waiting, he shut the engine down and climbed down the ladder. Roy didn't bother with small talk. Well, he said. Martin wiped his hands on his jeans. Corn's coming in good. Roy tilted his head. Good how? Martin named the number. Roy blinked once, the way a man does when he's sure he misheard something. You serious? Martin nodded. Roy turned and looked back at the field again. County average this year's about 120, he said slowly. Martin didn't answer. Roy did the math in his head anyway. You're telling me you're beating that? Martin said quietly, looks that way. Roy let out a long breath and rubbed the back of his neck. That's... He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. Farmers are careful about words when the land surprises them. Roy walked over to the combine and ran his hand along the metal frame like he was trying to make sense of what the machine had just told them. Maybe it's just this section, he said. Maybe. Martin didn't argue. They both knew the only way to settle, it was to keep harvesting. Roy stayed there longer than he meant to. Long enough to watch several more passes. Long enough to see that the numbers didn't drop. When he finally climbed back in his truck, he didn't laugh the way he had in spring. He didn't even say, "We'll see." He just drove away. News travels faster during harvest than at any other time of the year. Farmers compare numbers the way gamblers compare cards. By that evening, the first rumor had already reached the diner. Someone said Martin Cole's corn was coming in above the county average. Someone else said it wasn't just above average, it was well above. A third man said he didn't believe it. "Probably just one good patch," he said. "The rest of it will even out." Glenn Patterson heard the talk before sunset. The next morning he drove out again, this time alone. When he reached the field, the combine was already moving. Glenn stood by the road, watching the machine crawl through the rows. He stayed there until Martin reached the end of a pass and shut it down again. Glenn walked over slowly. "So," he said, trying to keep his voice casual, "I hear you're getting lucky." Martin climbed down. That's one way to describe it. Glenn looked toward the open grain tank where golden kernels sat piled inside. "What's the number?" Martin told him. Glenn frowned. "That can't be right." Martin shrugged. Glenn looked back at the field. For the first time all year, he didn't seem amused. "Maybe it's just the weather," he said. "Could be." Glenn pointed at the rows where the beans twisted up the corn stalks. "Those things didn't choke the corn the way I said they would." Martin said nothing. Glenn shifted his weight, annoyed by the silence. "Still think you'll regret it next year," he muttered. But the conviction wasn't there anymore. By the time Martin finished harvesting the corn, the numbers had become impossible to ignore. 142 bushels per acre. The county average that year sat around 120. 22 bushels above average. And that was only half the story, because the beans were still standing in the field. Most farmers in Lancaster County had already finished their soybeans by then. Martin's beans had grown differently, climbing the corn through the season. They needed their own pass with a combine. Roy returned the day Martin started harvesting them. He didn't park by the road this time. He drove straight into the yard and walked out to the field without saying a word. The combine cut through the bean rows, the pods snapping and feeding into the machine. Martin checked the numbers again after the first pass. 32 bushels per acre. Not a full soybean crop, but more than enough to matter. When he finished the pass and climbed down, Roy was standing there waiting. "Let me get this straight," Roy said slowly. "You're telling me you got 142 bushels of corn?" Martin nodded. Roy pointed at the field. "And you're still pulling beans out of the same ground?" Martin nodded again. Roy looked across the field in silence for several seconds. "I've been farming 40 years, he said finally, "and I've never seen anything like that." Martin leaned against the combine. "Neither had I." Roy shook his head slowly. "How many bushels?" Martin told him. Roy laughed then, but it wasn't the same laugh as spring. This one was shorter, sharper. A man laughing at the moment, he realizes something he believed for years might not be as solid as he thought. "Well, I'll be damned," Roy said. "You really did it." Martin didn't answer right away. He looked out across the rows again, the way he had done all summer. "The field did it," he said quietly. Roy grunted. "Don't go getting humble on me now." But even Roy knew something had shifted. Within a week, the whole county knew the numbers. Farmers repeated them in low voices like they were talking about a rare storm or a strange animal someone had spotted out near the highway. Some men tried to explain it away. "Good soil," they said. "Always been good soil." Others blamed the weather. "Must have caught more rain." But those explanations didn't sit right with people who had farmed nearby fields for years. The soil hadn't changed. The rain had fallen on everyone's land the same way. The only real difference anyone could point to was the one they had laughed at all spring. Corn and beans in the same field. Glenn Patterson heard the final numbers at the dealership 2 days later. A young farmer mentioned them while waiting for a part. Glenn listened without saying much. After the man left, Glenn walked out into the lot and stood beside a row of new tractors. He stared across the highway toward the fields beyond town. Finally, he muttered to himself, "1 year doesn't prove anything." And in a way, he was right. 1 year never proves anything in farming. The land can reward a man one season and punish him the next. Luck has fooled better farmers than Martin Cole. But 1 year was enough to do something else. It was enough to silence the laughter. At the diner that week, someone used the nickname again. Double Trouble Martin, the man said. But this time the tone was different. The smirk behind it had faded. Because now everyone in Lancaster County knew something they hadn't expected to know. The crazy idea had worked. And the man they had been laughing at all summer had just walked away with 2 harvests from the same field. The problem with a surprise like that is what it does to the people who witnessed it. Because once you see something work that you were certain would fail, it leaves a question hanging in the air. What if it works again? And as the combines finished their last passes that October, that was the question beginning to move quietly through Lancaster County. What if Martin Cole hadn't just been lucky? What if he had been right? The thing about surprising people once is that they can still explain away. Farmers do that all the time. The land has moods, and everyone who works it long enough has seen strange seasons that never repeat. So when Martin Cole's numbers made their way through Lancaster County that fall, the laughter didn't disappear overnight. It changed shape. Instead of saying Martin was crazy, people began saying he had been lucky. Luck is a comfortable explanation. It protects everything people already believe. If something unusual happens once, you can call it luck and go right back to doing what you've always done. That's exactly what most of the county expected would happen next. Winter came, the fields froze over, and by the time the next planting season rolled around, people assumed Martin would quietly return to the normal rotation. Corn one year, beans the next. That was the safe road. That was the road every other farmer in Lancaster County planned to stay on. But when April came again and Martin's tractor rolled back into the same field, the county learned something about him they had not fully understood yet. He planted corn, and then he planted beans between the rows again. The story started all over. Roy Dennison saw the rows forming from his truck and shook his head slowly. You're doing it again, he said later that afternoon when he walked over. Martin nodded. Worked once. Roy gave a short laugh. That's exactly why I'd be careful. Martin wiped the dirt from his hands and looked across the field. You think I should stop because it worked? Roy shrugged. I think lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. Martin smiled a little. We'll see. And they did see, because the next harvest came in strong again. Not identical to the year before. No season ever is, but strong enough to make the county pause. The corn beat the average again. The beans added another second crop on top. The fertilizer bill stayed lower than most farmers were paying. And that was the detail that started getting people's attention more than anything else. In the early 1970s, fertilizer prices were rising fast. Nitrogen cost real money, and every farmer knew it. Martin was using less of it. The beans, just like the book had said, were feeding nitrogen back into the soil. It sounded strange when people first heard it, but the numbers didn't argue. By the mid-1970s, Martin was spending roughly 40% less on fertilizer than many of his neighbors. And yet his corn yields stayed above average. It didn't take long for the nickname to start shifting. People still called him Double Trouble Martin sometimes, but the edge had faded from it. The tone changed from mockery to curiosity. A few farmers even started asking quiet questions. How close are the bean rows? One man asked him at the grain elevator. What variety are you using? Another asked a week later. Martin answered every question the same way he always answered things, plainly, without trying to sound clever. He explained how he spaced the rows, how he chose climbing beans instead of bush beans, how he harvested the corn first and then came back for the beans. Some people listened. Most people didn't. Changing a habit that has worked for generations is harder than admitting someone else might be right. So the county watched Martin for several years the way people watch a strange machine that keeps running when it shouldn't. Each season they expected the system to break, and each season it didn't. By the end of the decade, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Martin's yields floated somewhere between 10 and 25% above the county average, depending on the year. Some seasons were better than others, but the overall picture stayed the same. 2 crops from the same ground. Lower fertilizer costs. Healthy soil. Still, most farmers stayed with the methods they knew. Not because they thought Martin was wrong anymore, but because trying something different always carries risk. And then 1980 arrived. The farm crisis didn't begin with a single moment. It crept in the way financial trouble usually does, slowly at first, then all at once. Interest rates climbed higher than anyone expected. Loans that had seemed manageable suddenly doubled in cost. Land values, which had been rising through the 1970s, began to collapse. And then the crop prices started falling. Corn was hit hard. A bushel that had sold for more than $3 a few years earlier dropped below $2. That kind of drop doesn't sound dramatic to people who don't farm, but for farmers it changes everything. Equipment payments stay the same. Land payments stay the same, but the money coming in shrinks. Across Nebraska, farms that had looked stable only a few years earlier began slipping toward foreclosure. Lancaster County felt it just like everywhere else. Roy Dennison had expanded during the good years. Many farmers had. When interest rates jumped to 18%, his loan payments ballooned. The corn harvest that fall barely covered half of what he owed. The bank began making calls. Roy tried to stay calm about it. Farmers are used to hard years. But by the end of summer, the truth was clear. He was going to lose part of his land. Meanwhile, Glenn Patterson's equipment dealership began feeling the shock from another direction. Farmers who were barely holding on to their farms weren't buying new tractors. Sales slowed. Repairs replaced upgrades. Glenn spent more time staring at his books than he ever had before. In town, the effects were just as visible. The feed store cut staff. The diner closed early some nights because fewer farmers came in for breakfast. A sense of quiet strain settled over the county. Martin watched it happen the same way everyone else did. He knew these people. He had grown up beside them. None of this felt like victory. It felt like watching a storm roll through the lives of men he had known for decades. But numbers don't care about feelings. When Martin brought his harvest in that fall, the math looked very different from many of his neighbors' fields. His corn yield came in around 145 bushels per acre. At roughly $2.10 per bushel, that worked out to about $300 per acre. Not a great year, but manageable. Then came the second half of the equation. Martin harvested about 35 bushels of soybeans per acre from the same field. Soybean prices had not crashed the way corn prices had. At nearly $7 per bushel, those beans added more than $200 per acre. When the totals were added together, Martin was bringing in over $500 per acre. Roy Dennison's numbers told a different story. His corn yield came in around 120 bushels per acre. Multiply that by the same price, and the total barely crossed $250 per acre. No beans. No second crop. Just corn. The difference between the two systems suddenly became brutally clear. Martin wasn't just ahead. He was making roughly twice as much money from the same amount of land. And he was doing it while spending less on fertilizer. The moment the county truly understood that difference didn't happen in a field, it happened at the grain elevator one afternoon in October. Martin had just finished delivering a load of corn when Roy walked in carrying a folded sheet of paper from the bank. The two men stood beside the scale while the machinery hummed around them. Roy looked older than he had the year before. Stress does that to a man. Finally, he said, "How'd you do this year?" Martin answered quietly, "Good enough." Roy nodded slowly. "Corn good?" "Yes." Roy swallowed. "Beans too?" "Yes." Roy leaned against the wall and stared at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "I should have tried it," he said. Martin didn't answer. Roy shook his head. 10 years ago, I should have tried it." Martin finally said, "You could have." Roy gave a tired smile. "You want to know why I didn't?" Martin waited. Roy said, "Because my daddy never did it. Because nobody around here ever did it. Because I figured if it really worked, somebody smarter than me would have already thought of it." Martin nodded. "I thought the same thing once." Roy looked up. "Then why'd you try?" Martin said, "Because I found a book that said people have been doing it for 1,000 years. Roy stared at him. 1,000 years. Martin nodded. Native American farmers. Corn, beans, squash. They called it the Three Sisters. Roy let out a long breath and leaned back against the wall. "All this time," he said quietly, "all this time we had tractors and chemicals and machines, and we forgot something that's simple." Martin shrugged slightly. "Happens sometimes." Roy unfolded the paper in his hand and glanced at it before folding it again. "Bank's taking the North 160, he said. Martin felt the words land like a weight in the room. Roy pushed himself away from the wall. I made my choices, he said. Can't blame anyone else. He walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. You know what you did, Martin? Martin said nothing. Roy answered his own question. You put your eggs in 2 baskets. He gave a tired nod. And when one basket broke, you still had the other. Then he stepped outside into the October sunlight and drove away. That conversation stayed with Martin longer than the harvest numbers ever did. Because that was the moment the county stopped thinking of his field as an experiment and started thinking of it as something else entirely. A different way to survive. Roy Dennison wasn't the only one who started looking at Martin Cole differently after that year. Word spread the way it always does in farming communities, quietly through conversations that start with numbers and end with questions. Men who had laughed about Martin a decade earlier began asking him how he had done it. Not loudly, not all at once, but slowly, season after season, the questions started showing up. They came at the grain elevator. They came in the feed store. Sometimes they came out in the fields themselves, when a truck would pull into Martin's yard and a farmer would climb out, hat in hand, pretending he was just passing by. The questions were always the same. How close do you plant to beans? What kind of beans climb best? How do you harvest them without ruining the corn rows? Martin answered every one of them. He didn't charge for the advice. He didn't give speeches about how everyone had been wrong about him. And he never once said the phrase people half expected to hear from him. I told you so. Eleanor asked him about that once. It was a late evening in the kitchen after a long day in the fields. You realize, she said, half the county used to laugh at you. Martin smiled a little and poured himself a cup of coffee. I remember. You could remind them of that. Martin shook his head. What would be the point? Eleanor leaned against the counter and watched him. Most men would enjoy it. Martin sat down and thought about that for a moment before answering. Maybe, he said, but if I start treating this like something I won, then nobody learns anything from it. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And that matters more to you? Martin nodded once. The whole point is for the idea to spread. That was the kind of man he was. By the early 1990s, more than a dozen farms around Lancaster County had begun experimenting with some version of Martin's method. Some farmers planted beans between every second row of corn. Others tried different spacing patterns. Agricultural extension agents from the University of Nebraska came out to study the fields and write reports about what they were seeing. They had a new name for what Martin had been doing since 1971. They called it intercropping, sustainable agriculture, regenerative farming. Those were the modern terms. Martin just called it common sense. He never claimed he had invented anything. If anyone praised him for the idea, he would wave the compliment away and say the same thing he had said for years. I didn't invent it, he told people. I just read about it and tried it. But the truth was that trying it had been the hardest part. Plenty of people read about things in books. Very few people risk 80 acres of farmland to see if those things actually work. The farm itself changed hands the way all family farms eventually do. As Martin grew older, his son Thomas took on more of the work. The system stayed the same. Corn and beans together. 2 harvests when the season allowed it. Healthy soil that seemed to improve instead of wearing out. Martin slowed down gradually. Farming has a way of doing that to men. One year, you notice the tractor seat feels a little harder to climb into. A few seasons later, the long days start taking more out of you than they used to. By the mid-2000s, Martin was spending more time walking the fields than running equipment. But he was still there, still watching the crops, still answering questions from younger farmers who wanted to see the rows for themselves. Then, in 2007, a stroke forced him to step away from the work entirely. For a man who had spent his whole life tied to the rhythm of planting and harvest, that was the hardest adjustment of all. He lasted less than a year after that. Martin Cole died in 2008 at the age of 75. The funeral was held at the Lutheran church in town. On a normal Sunday, the building seated maybe 100 people. That day, the pews filled early. Farmers came from 3 counties away. Some of them had known Martin since he was a boy. Others had only known him by reputation. A few agricultural researchers came as well, along with a reporter from a farming magazine who had been writing about intercropping. Pastor Williams stood at the front of the church and looked out over the crowd before beginning. He had known Martin for 40 years, long enough to understand what had actually happened in those fields. The pastor talked about Martin's faith first, then about his family, then about the farm that had been in the Cole family since the 1800s. But everyone in the room knew there was another part of the story that had brought them there. Finally, Pastor Williams addressed it directly. When Martin Cole planted 2 crops in the same field, he said, a lot of people thought he had made a mistake. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the church. The pastor smiled gently. Some of you may even remember laughing about it. That laughter faded quickly. Pastor Williams went on. But Martin kept planting, year after year. And when times got hard for farmers in this county, that strange field that has helped keep his farm alive. He paused for a moment before continuing. Martin never tried to take credit for the idea. He said it came from a book about Native American farming. Corn, beans, and squash growing together. The 3 sisters. The pastor closed his Bible for a moment and rested his hands on the podium. Martin didn't invent the method, he said, but he remembered it. And sometimes remembering something old can change the future. When the service ended, people stepped outside into the sunlight and stood talking in small groups. Stories drifted through the air the way they often do after funerals. Men remembered the first time they had seen Martin's field. Some admitted they had been part of the crowd that laughed. Others talked about the first year they tried planting beans between their own rows and realized Martin had been right. Down at the cemetery, Eleanor stood beside the stone that had been prepared ahead of time. It was simple. That was the way Martin would have wanted it. Just his name, his dates, and one short line carved beneath them. He planted 2 seeds and fed the world. Underneath that, in smaller letters, were 2 words that had once been the source of so many jokes in Lancaster County. Corn and beans. The farm itself did not disappear after Martin was gone. Farms rarely do when families care enough to keep them alive. Thomas ran the land for several more years before stepping back himself. Today, the fields belong to Martin's granddaughter, Rachel Cole. She grew up watching the same rows her grandfather had planted decades earlier. Corn rising tall, beans climbing quietly along the stalks. Visitors still come sometimes. Students from agricultural programs, farmers from other states. They stand at the edge of the field the way Roy Dennison once did, trying to understand why something so simple had once seemed impossible. Rachel usually tells them the story the same way every time. She tells them about the day her grandfather walked into a feed store and bought 2 kinds of seed. She tells them about the laughter, and she tells them about the harvest that came afterward. Sometimes people ask her if Martin Cole was a genius. Rachel always shakes her head at that question. No, she says. He wasn't smarter than everyone else. She looks out across the rows when she says it, the same way her grandfather used to. He just wasn't afraid to try something different. Then she bends down, picks a bean pod from between the corn stalks, and rolls it in her fingers before handing it to the visitor standing beside her. My grandfather used to say something, she adds. He said the most dangerous words in farming are we've always done it this way. She pauses long enough for the idea to settle. Those words have probably ruined more farms than drought ever did. The visitor usually looks back out across the field again after hearing that. 2 crops sharing the same ground. 2 harvests waiting in the same soil. A system that had been sitting quietly in the world for centuries before Martin Cole decided to trust it. And somewhere in that quiet Nebraska field, the old lesson is still there for anyone willing to see it. Put everything in one basket, and you'd better hope you never drop it. Put your chances in 2 baskets, and when the bad years come, and they always do, you might still have something left to carry home.